This is the Vanderbilt coach house. We call it the coach house. It was built in 1897. It replaced the cow barn on the property. It was designed by Robert H. Robertson. And the myth, or I say the myth among the staff, is that Mrs. Vanderbilt wanted a different style mansion. She wanted more of a European style, and she got this Beaux-Arts classical revival, and then they claim that she got her more European style with this place. I think that it's because Robert A. Robertson designed buildings like this, and the other big project he was working on at the time was designing the house and barns for Lila Chalkley Webb up in Vermont, Vanderbilt's sister. Again, it was built in 1897, and it was called the Stables, because the coach house is really only the chamber in which the carriages were stored. Then according to the HSR, it was 1910. I've also heard 1907, 1908. But around 1910, it was converted for motor cars, and then it was called the Stables Garage, or Garage Stables. Then in 1941, when the Army took over, it was converted into barracks for the military police company. And then in 1947, it was converted again to administrative offices for the park. This is where the whole park administrative offices were from 1947 to 1957, when they moved up to the pavilion and then moved to Belfield in 1976. So anyway, the place has gone through four major architectural changes. Originally is the stables and carriage house, then is the garage. Then when the Army ripped the tile roof off, put on a shingle roof and ripped the cupola off, and when they made it barracks, and then when the Park Service altered the interior, then in the mid-70s the tile roof was put back on and the reproduction cupola was put on the building. So go through some of the exterior stuff. The only main doorway in 1897 was this one. The door in the carriage house side was added in 1910 when it became motor cars. And walk through and take a look at what's going on. Oh, one other thing on the outside. I can't prove it. One of these days I put the time in researching. But if you take a look at the brickwork has wide white bands, and then although a lot of it's fallen out, the space between the bricks was mixed with the brick dust and filled in so it looked like continuous bands. And I think this is the only building that Robert H. Robertson used that in. But I do believe that a junior draftsman working in a neighboring firm caught on to it and turned it into a career. So what does it remind you of? Prairie House stuff. Frank Lloyd Wright was a junior draftsman on a firm next door to Robert H. Robertson, and I think that he took it off of this drawing and turned it into a career design on a multi-trillion buildings that look like that. Anyway, we'll go in and take a look at talk about the interior a little bit. You may want to go on break. You're welcome to stay for the tour if you like.
Because I got a lot of work to go.
Yeah. Now what you want to do is you want to look, not at me, but at the room while we're talking. That's called a lay light. That's actually a false skylight. The real skylight is actually part of the peaked roof above it. And as you're looking out here, in 1897, that was an opening into double stalls. The wide window straight back was an opening into a group of single stalls. And that window was an opening out to the wash area in the coach house. So in 1897, the carriage would be pushed out, the team would be dressed up, hooked up, and they'd leave here. Then when they came back in, the team would be broken down here, and if it was a double horse or four horses, they'd be brought out. The tack would be carried through and cleaned and put away from there, and the coach would be pushed out, cleaned in the next room over, and then pushed out into the coach house. Then in 1910, it converted to motor cars. He covered the 1897 windows with these steel and wired glass windows to make it fireproof. Closed that opening off, closed that opening off. They ripped out all the stalls with the cast iron post supports, resupported it from the roof, and then put in a tin ceiling to make it a garage. And then in the room where our tree worker now has his workshop, that was the mechanic shop. It's just the blocks where the line shafting was to run the belts for the various machines. A chauffeur at the time had to make his own parts and fix his own cars. So Mrs. Vanderbilt still liked to ride her Rockaway, so they kept the stables like that. And at that point, the horse would be brought down. The tack room was built into the large washroom here, which is now our break room. The horse would be brought down, dressed out here, brought out through the new doorway in the coach house, out to ride, and then back again. Then when the Army took over, they came in, and that's where a lot of these Modine heaters were put in. This was the motor pool for the 240th Military Police Company. Upstairs, the hayloft was refloored as a rec room, and the coach house became the barracks. But where they washed the horses down, they put in about 6 shower stalls to wash the GIs down. The stalls were all ripped up and thrown into the battery room at the powerhouse because Gertrude Cooper, the superintendent at the time, gave away all the lead and copper to the war drive along with the top of the fence that existed along Route 9. That stone fence actually had a wrought iron top that she had cut off and gave to the scrap drive. And that became the mess hall for the troops.
When did this become a park department?
1940-41, the Park Service took over. We stopped operating the powerhouse in 41, and that's Central Hudson ran power into the powerhouse and distributed AC power. Yeah, Vanderbilt had power in 1897, but Hyde Park didn't get it until 1917 when the wires came up. So that's the main chamber, and what we'll do is we'll walk around the first floor up the back stairs. There was a manure pit in the corner and the double stalls, and that was removed, and that's where the staircase went for the GIs. The place was built with running water, so that lower part of the wall is the 1897 bathroom for the Sable staff, and then this upper area I think was added either by the GIs in World War II for more privacy, or it was added by the Park Service when it was park offices. What we're standing above right now is this little section right here. From the outside wall to here, and from that wall to this wall, is the only section that has a basement over it. Well, right here, when you go down about 3 feet, you hit a solid piece of ledge rock that extends right out to the stream. So they literally blasted a basement hole out of here so we could central heating. Now again, in 1897, this room, this whole area did not exist. It was one open area. This was the whole wash area where the carriage would be put out and the harness would be cleaned and hung up. The floor is the original 1897 floor. What's old is new again. This was in 1897, this was all the latest rage, which is popular now, which is dyeing and patterned in concrete. This was called cast granite. And if you look around our junk, you can see the bases for the shower stalls that were put in here for the GIs. And then the carriage, like I said, this was open until 1910. Then it was closed in. That became the tack room in 1910. The room further back was the blanket room, and then the room off the stalls was the grain room, as I recall. I don't recall 1910. But. And then this is the coach house of the coach house.
Oh, wow.
Again, I'm presuming these schoolhouse lights were put in by the Army when this was barracks, the old Modine heater. This was the barracks for the enlisted men of the 240th Military Police Company. Generally speaking, according to the chauffeur, Doug Crapser, he claimed that Mr. Vanderbilt never came down here. He would phone down for a car. There was an internal telephone system, and there was one phone line out the property, and that ran from Mr. Vanderbilt's office. But he would use the internal system, and they would call up for cars. But call your attention to the total wainscoting, the hammerhead beams, the car camera head beams. I mean, this was just for storage, and like I said, the gentleman would never see it.
And these are all their carriages that
No, these are mostly, these are not, most of the Vanderbilt stuff was sold off Smith family of Orange County. They had that museum village down near Monroe. He bought most of the Vanderbilt stuff. Most of what you see here is Roosevelt. As far as I know, the only Vanderbilt carriage is the little black one in the corner. I'm told that's the Rockaway coupe that Mrs. Vanderbilt used to like to ride around the estate in after they went to motor cars. And the two tall ones in the back there, the wagon brake and the skeleton brake, those are from the Brook collection, but they're identical to ones that were on the estate, and that was for sports driving, when the gentleman would take the reins of the 4 or 6 horse hitches and ride them. Most of the rest of the carriages and the sleighs are Roosevelt. Except for, I always was told that Russian sleigh was one that was Roosevelt brought back from his honeymoon trip, but I've since learned that's not true. Mrs. Vanderbilt bought it from the Tsar's household livery. And that's the sleigh she used to ride. That's the one furthest in the back. And actually I don't know, it's a sleigh, it's a sledge because the runners are filled in. The rest of these are all Roosevelt. The carriages, the cars are Vanderbilt.
Oh, the cars are?
Yeah. The one in the end, the white depot hack, the Vanderbilts had like 3 levels. When they finally started to buy liveries of cars, they really, according to the chauffeur, they had like 3 levels of vehicles. They had these work vehicles, they had their limousines, and then they'd have 1 or 2 of sort of a medium ilk, like the equivalent of like a Buick or Oldsmobile that they'd use for running around when they didn't want to clean up the limousines and so on. This is a 1913 white depot hack. When this went out of service, it was given to the chauffeur. Then the chauffeur gave it back to the estate, and my predecessor in curatorial, Ed Dowling, restored that one. And that's like the forerunner of the minivan. The seats fold up for the servants, or they fold down for the trunks and luggage. This one is in Mrs. Vanderbilt's colors. This is a Crane Simplex. And this one is rarer than rare. The Crane Company, Crane Simplex, never built a closed car. They built an open touring car. And the story I have on that one from the chauffeur is, you wonder where I get the information from. The chauffeur was still alive when I started here, and he had a very clear mind. So the chauffeur, when he was in the AEF, he was in the U.S. Army in World War I. He was the driver, the personal driver for Cornelius Vanderbilt IV, who was a brigadier general in the American Army in World War I. And he said that when he's driving around, the general said, well, when the war is over, I'll write a letter of introduction to my uncle in Hyde Park, because Doug was a Hyde Park native, and get you a job. So he got a job as second driver, and then he said the first chauffeur was fired for drunkenness. He became the first driver. Anyway, he was driving the Vanderbilts back to New York City, and the Millses came down alongside him, and the Millses always had big Nash touring cars. Nash was a much bigger car than we remember it to be when they went out of business and they merged. And it got him to be a bit of a race, and he said that the chauffeur claims he beat the Millses into New York City to 5th Avenue, but when he got there, Mrs. Vanderbilt was in a corner of the seat with her makeup a mess and her wig hat blown off, making little squeaky noises like, ooh, ooh, ooh. So Mr. Vanderbilt had the car a week later brought to Brooks Ostrich, which was a famous New York City coach builder, and had the custom closed aluminum body put on it, the limousine body, Prince of Wales body. So this one served from 1918 to about 1923. It's in Mrs. Vanderbilt's colors, because I was told by the chauffeur that after that, before Mrs. Vanderbilt died, there was like him and her limousines. Mrs. Vanderbilt tended to favor Packards, and when she passed away, Mr. Vanderbilt donated the Packards to like the local fire and ambulance companies to be converted into vehicles for them. And then his colors were basically maroon and white, and he had Minervas. They also had a Rolls Royce after World War I, but they got rid of that because it was so unreliable.
Rolls Royce,
Yeah.
unreliable.
Yep. And anyway, I don't want to take too much of your time dwelling. I can talk about these cars all day long.
Sounds like it.
And this, he had, like I said, he had Minervas. He had a 23 Minerva and then later a 26 Minerva. When he went to trade in the 23 on a 33 Minerva, which was a Belgian-built chassis with French coachwork, the chauffeur said he showed him the brochure for the new Cadillac, and Mr. Vanderbilt decided to go for the Cadillac. By the way, this is one of 37 known survivors around the world, so it's a pretty rare car. This one is in a sense even more rare. This one, 33 Cadillac, 1933 they made 123 V16 engines. 88 of them went into motor cars. The others were sold for airplane engines or power boats or whatever. And this one, some arguably Cadillac collectors consider to be the plus non qua of 30s Cadillacs, because it's the earlier V16 engine, which is quieter, but also in 32 Cadillac still had the straight up and down grille, like the Crane Simplex. And by 34 they went to wide painted bars with big squares, which look kind of clunky. So this is the only year of the small egg crate grille. It's considered one of the finest Cadillac front ends of the 1930s. It's a V16.
V16?
Yep. And the whole idea was for smooth power, not raw speed. Although this will easily, Doug said he had this one up to 106.
Yeah.
But the V8, the V12, and the V16, there's only about 15 horsepower difference between them, because the V8 had these huge coffee can pistons, and this V16 has more like lawnmower size. The whole idea was more explosions spread out evenly over a longer crankshaft makes the whole engine quieter, and the torque curve is more powerful. When we used to take this out to show it to the public, I took it out one day after I just tuned it all up, and on the bottom of the hill going up to the mansion, I had it in high gear, and just to see, I let it go down to about 3 miles an hour. And then I stepped on the gas again, and normally with a car it'll buck and die out on you. This thing just sped up and took up, didn't make any noise, just purred all the way up. And that was the point of the 16-cylinder engine.
So
This-
you still periodically turn these?
No, we don't. We haven't in 20 years now since I left curatorial, but we used to have both of these cars operational. We used to bring them up and show them in front of the mansion. So
Will we just have to sit here and...
for the film, I could go on with anecdotes with the chauffeur, but I don't know whether I want to take your time today with it. But my favorite anecdote about this Cadillac, though, I will mention that one, is Doug told me, because I think it's indicative of Lulu. Doug told me one day he got a phone call from Lulu to bring up the limousine, and Lulu, normally they didn't do that. Like I said, they had a lower, like a old Buick or Oldsmobile they used for running around. So he brought up the limousine, and Mrs. Vanderbilt got in, and on the way out of the estate, they passed a bunch of workmen near the overlook with raking up leaves. So she had him stop the limousine, and the foreman came over and touched his cap. She said, she looked at the foreman and said, "Hi, John." Well, his name wasn't John, but now they talk about Johns being sex workers, customers. Well, back in that day, a woman of a higher or equal social station, if she didn't know the man's name, referred to him as John, a John. And just like one guy would say to another, "Hey, Mac," you know. So, "Hi, John." "Well, hello, Mrs. Vanderbilt." "Well, it's getting kind of cold out here." "Well, we're working away." "Well, you boys need sweaters. I'm going to get you sweaters." So she goes, and they go into Poughkeepsie. They stop in front of Lucky Platt. She makes him stop the limousine in the middle of Main Street, goes into Lucky Platt. A little while later, a cop comes over, starts writing a ticket on the car, because there were 28 big estates along the river, so a limousine was not an unknown thing. Starts writing a ticket. She comes out, the guy's following with the boxes of sweaters, takes one look at the cop, says, "Hi, John." The cop goes, "Oh, hello, Mrs. Vanderbilt.
Yeah.
How are the girls getting on? Just fine, Mrs. Vanderbilt. How'd you work? Fine, Mrs. Vanderbilt. Yells at the chauffeur, don't park it in the middle of Main Street. Well, it turns out that when they weren't in residence, they gave, Mrs. Vanderbilt believed that all young women should know how to cook and sew, so they gave cooking and sewing lessons when they weren't in the mansion, and that she put on periodic, like, dinner dances for the local volunteer firemen and for the cops and their wives and stuff. Anyway, so they leave, come back to the estate. She pulls in, there's another group working around near the main gate. She has Doug stop and gives them the sweaters. So when Doug drops her off, he has to run and tell Mr. Vanderbilt, so Mr. Vanderbilt can use the one phone line that goes out of the property to call Lucky Platt to have a duplicate order waiting so that he could run back out to Poughkeepsie, pick up the duplicate order and give them to the crew that had been promised him on the way off the estate.
So is this considered the limo?
Hmm?
Is this considered the limo?
Oh, well, they're both limousines.
Oh,
They're both limousines, but this one is oh yeah, it said they may put 88 in the motor cars. Out of the 88 V16s that went in the motor cars, Fleetwood only made 2 body styles of this style that year. One was made on the shortened V8 chassis, the other one on the V16. So this was the only V16 extended chassis put together of this style that year. So that's what they call a one-off. Now, when Mrs. Vanderbilt died, this car, Daisy Van Allen, took it to Newport with her, and the 26 Minerva was sold off, and the 57 or 58, Daisy gave it back, and somebody went out there and drove it back from Newport. It only has like 10,000 some odd miles on it. Anyway, I got the Cadillac running again, and we got the Crane Simplex running, and the AACA used to have its meet on the grounds. So the guy, the Minerva surfaced. Apparently it was kept in a barn during World War II because it had oddball-sized tires, and tires were almost impossible to get. So a doctor up in Rhinebeck, Dr. Varelli, found the thing, bought it, had it restored, called us up and said, would you like to come see it? We said, well, of course, can we take pictures for the archive so we've got a record of the car? So he said, sure, come on up. So we called up the chauffeur, Doug Crapser, and said, Doug, the Minerva surfaced, do you want to see it again? Doug said, sure. So we stopped by his house over on Parker Avenue there. Doug comes, I can't remember whether he was on 1 cane or he was up to 2 canes at that point, but he gets halfway out to the car, holds his hand up, goes back in the house. We figured, well, old guy, he just had breakfast, coffee, needs to make a pit stop, blah, blah, blah. Comes out, we go up to see Dr. Varelli. Doctor says, yeah, I even painted it Vanderbilt's colors, maroon and black. And Doug says, no. Every other car he had was maroon and black, but the 26 Minerva, Daisy Van Allen picked it out, and Daisy picked out yellow. It was canary yellow and black.
the car?
The car. And so he says, yeah, and I can't figure out this thing. And right in between the fenders, had jutting fenders like this, was this teardrop-shaped box. And Doug says, oh, he said, I had that put on in 27 because there was no place to carry my tools. And he reaches into his pocket. What he went back in the house for was he had duplicates of every key for every Vanderbilt vehicle. And he reaches in the key ring, takes off one, opens up the toolbox, hands the key to Dr. Varelli, and there was all his tools still wrapped in the rags and everything else. Hadn't been opened during the restoration. Anyway, Dr. Varelli said, well, the AACA meet, I'll bring the Minerva down if you'll bring the Cadillac out for the day. So we did, and that was the first time the cars have been together since the old man died.
And when was that?
That was 1978. And so we went to start the Concours Parade, and the Minerva threw its fan belt, so he had to race back to Rhinebeck. Fan belt wasn't as crucial on cars back then. It only ran the fan, so if you could keep it above 30 miles an hour, more air would be passing in than the fan would generate and would stay cool. So he ran back. I went to get the Cadillac started with people talking around the car. I couldn't hear the car start. I actually had to raise the hood and see the fan engage, that I knew the engine had started. And then when it started, it hammered. And I thought, oh, Jesus, it threw a rod. And Doug was there leaning on his cane. I said, Doug, I think I effed up your car. He says, no, same thing happened going to Newport. It's just the fan belt. Don't worry about it. I said, well, hop in, Doug. And took off and came back to the coach house and parked it. And sure enough, the fan belt was so thick, the inner piece broke loose and it would hit like a rubber hammer, hit the pulley at low speed, making a noise like a bad connecting rod. High speed would fold back up in. So I was thinking, what am I going to do? Where do you get a fan belt for a V16 Cadillac? So I called around and Troy Belton said, oh, we'll make one for you. This was back in the 70s for $350 and all that. Well, it turned out decent, so when they were still in Poughkeepsie, I went down there because I had heard they were throwing out like locomobile fenders and things like that to make room. Went down there and I said, I need a fan belt. They said, what for? I said, 33 V16 Cadillac. And all the mechanics waiting for parts started laughing. The guy came back like 30 minutes later and said, how many do you need? I said, how many have you got? He said, we got 3 of them in stock. I said, no you don't, because I'm buying them all. And there should be somewhere in a box here, there should still be 2 spare fan belts for the Cadillac. Whenever everybody asked me, what did I do for parts? I said, oh, I just drive into Poughkeepsie and pick up whatever I can.
Well, it's a shame they don't,
Yeah.
keep it going.
Well, members of the curatorial division who are there not even lift the hood to show you the engine, but the engine's magnificent on this thing. Anyway, I've wasted too much time on cars. I love cars. Again, this was all built after 1910. This was one open room. The pieces of furniture actually are from the pavilion. This, I don't know whether I think the Army put this in when this became the mess hall. That became, what was the blanket room became the cook's offices, and what was the grain room was clad in asbestos sheeting and became the kitchen. So these cast iron pillars couldn't be taken out here when this was made a mess hall because they're helping support the second floor. They were ripped out of the first floor there, and the second floor was resupported from the ceiling. So this was the single stalls here. That wall, I believe, was put up by the Army, as was the second one, because there were offices and storerooms back there. This is one of the 2 hay drops. The other one was eliminated from the hay mow up above us. So again, in 1941, this was turned into barracks. And then in 1957, or 1947, when the Park Service had offices on the second floor, this became the maintenance operation. And was the maintenance operation, this was like the B&U shops until 75, 76, when B&U moved to Belfield and Roads and Grounds stayed here. Anyway, I told you all the stall and stuff had been moved up to the powerhouse. Well, in the mid-80s, we cleaned out the powerhouse and all the stall stuff is stacked there. So if we ever get around to it, we can restore all the stalls through here.
Oh. So why were these beams put in? Because there wasn't the Army.
No, these weren't part of the stalls. In other words, you have a
these
stall
were.
box here, stall here with a gate. But they were, to make that an open mechanics bay, in 1910, they pulled all these columns out over there and then had to re-support with threaded iron rod that you'll see upstairs.
Oh,
re-support
that's
the
not,
second
I
floor.
thought these were replaced.
No, these were actually your stall
Okay.
separators for the single box
Okay.
stall. And in fact, you can see under the pile of stuff, that's all the stalls and stall doors put in here.
Wow.
So in 1897, this wall didn't exist. This was put in 1910, the back wall here. And they still had the manure pit in here. Then when the Army came in 41, they put a cast slab over the manure pit, made that storage, and put in this back staircase because this would be the rec hall for the troops. This is where they could go after eating in the evening and so on. Now it's important, I said about the staircase, because otherwise the double doors don't make sense, because that's how the hay would have been offloaded, and you wouldn't have offloaded hay over an open staircase like that.
Right.
So this was all hay mow, and there's those rods I was talking about. That replaced those cast iron columns in the double stall area. This whole ceiling did not exist. This was open to the rafters because this was all hay storage. And so this was put in by the Army, and as was this finished floor, and this was the rec hall during World War II.
What was under this floor? What's under this floor?
There you can see just the one layer of pine.
Oh, okay.
This was a little more finished.
Oh, okay.
So, and then the Park Service had just used this for storage. Theoretically, 80% of doors, windows, mantelpieces, built-in cabinets that have been pulled out of the historic buildings for one reason or other are all sitting back there. And we tried to save everything we could. This was built back in the 1970s or 80s for storage for different tenants. That very steep staircase up there goes, just beyond it there is the only attic space that you can walk on. And in fact, that clock you saw downstairs, that's the back of the clock. That's how you wind and set the clock. And that was a big circular window in 1897, and the circular window was stored up there.
And all this furniture is...
This is all, oh, this stuff came out of the mansion. And one of these days, Curatorial needs to do some research on this stuff, because I don't know whether this was put up there by the Park Service when the second and third floors were kind of a heartbreak hotel for the Park Service, when we used to have like training and so people could stay there on the third floor.
I just found out Carol Cullion lived up there on the third floor.
Yep. Well, when at first, the curator and Fred Rath shared the third floor as apartments back in 46, 47, when the home was being opened up. But later it was made into rooms for people. And I don't know whether this maple furniture was purchased by the Park Service for that function, or whether this was part of the furniture when the third floor during the war was actually where the off-duty Secret Service stayed. And I'm just wondering if it was World War II era Secret Service furniture, but nobody's done any research on it. It would be a worthy thing to find out, because it's either old junk or it's artifacts based on.
So this was all hay in this whole
Yep,
thing?
and again, this would have been right to the rafters. This would have been hay storage for the animals.
A lot of hay.
Well, you have a lot of animals with the double and single stalls. I mean, when I had 2 horses, my daughter had 2 horses, I used to put up 770 bales in the barn every fall for winter.
Wow.
Yeah. So these are the rest of the stall pieces that go into the first floor stalls and harness. Those are the decorative hinge covers for the main doors. You notice the main doors were like cheap plywood, texture 111. We have the main doors in with the stall stuff. We took them down because our machinery was wrecking them. So we put up doors that we could wreck and fix and so on, and whenever it gets returned to exhibit space, we can put the doors back up again, the original doors. So this was the area that was, this was actually rooms. This was built for, watch your step, this was built for rooms for like the grooms and the stablemen and stuff like that. And then the parks, there was park offices, and then later the Park Service divided it into apartments. So, and it's back to Park Service offices now.
Whose office is these?
Well, that one's unused. That one's Steve Hannenberg's. This one is Ann's. As you can see, we've spared every expense in maintaining this space so that we've got money to work on the public buildings. And this was a room that either the Army or the Park Service added. The Historic Structures report, they don't go through and differentiate between Park Service alterations and Army alterations. And just to orient you as to where you are, when you look through the window, you can look down into the vehicle area.
Dave, this is your office?
Now, according to the HSR, the Park Service enclosed this staircase in 1957. I'm not sure that the Army didn't do it earlier than that, because the soldiers would be barracked down there, and then in the Army what they used to call the shirts, which are the sergeants, non-coms, who were the adult supervision, would be up here. So. Now this was divided into two areas even historically, because originally this was built, designed by Robertson. The head man, the coachman's residence, would be this apartment here, and then the stablemen and grooms would be in those other rooms in the back. So the Park Service just added a second privacy door. And then the Park Service took my office and divided it into 2 bedrooms, and we undivided it back in the 1990s, back into one large room. So. Skull and crossbones flag. Anyway, this was the coachman's living room. The coachman actually never occupied the apartment, because further down Dock Street, or I guess it's still Market Street, there was a federal-style farmhouse that dated back to the Langdon period, and that's where the coachman lived. So basically this apartment was pretty much unused until the Army and the Park Service moved in. So, any questions on the coach house, or have I pretty well beaten
I
it?
don't know if we missed this, but I didn't know the Army was here. When did and how did that happen?
Well, it was in 1940. Briefly, the CCC had a camp where they did some of the maintenance. And then in 1940, to protect the president, the 240th Military Police Company came into town. And that's where the guardhouses on the home. The officers stayed in the H.H. Richardson building. I'm having a senior moment. It's not Crumwald. Crumelvo? Was it Crumwald? The estate. The Rogers estate was where the officers stayed, and then the non-coms and the enlisted men. This was turned into barracks because the building had already been turned into a garage by Vanderbilt. It made sense to use that as the motor pool and then the barracks for the enlisted men. And the Park Service terraformed it again into the park offices. So.
How many think servicemen were here?
Well, if it was a company is usually 123 officers and men, but there were sometimes reinforced companies or sub, depending on what kind of it was. That's sort of like, it's very confusing with things like divisions, because an armored division could be as few as 14,000, an infantry division could be as high as 22,000, 24,000. Depending on the unit, but around 123.
And this was all just for the army?
This was all to protect the president. Don't you know there was a law?
Yes.
And just briefly, we're going to be walking up the road past the, I'll point out the dams and the bridges as we get there, and we're on our way to the powerhouse. We call it the powerhouse. They called it the pump house because it did both. It pumped water for the estate and provided direct current for electricity. I guess they figured the water was more important. But as we go up, the first bridge, we're going to go over Cromwell Creek, and we're going to see a series of impoundments. And the impoundments that we can see have nothing to do with generating power on the estate. The dam that created Sherwood Pond that the penstock comes from is up under Route 9. There's a dam under the White Bridge, a dam just adjacent to the powerhouse called the Powerhouse Dam, but it has nothing to do directly with the powerhouse. And then below us, one we won't see today, the lower dam. And the whole purpose was to create scenic impoundments, basically create scenic pools for the estate. The bridge we're going to go over there, the Rustic Bridge, that's one of 2 Mealand Arch bridges that exist on the property. The other one is the White Bridge. And the Milan Arch Bridge, it was the first one that was kind of in a change period, but it was the first time that they used the dynamics of stressing steel in conjunction with concrete to build road bridges. We have the last two that I know of are road bridges in the east. There's one in Central Park that's now a footbridge, and then the other ones that are still in service are at Vicksburg Battlefield, because the Civil War vets in charge of the government at the time, they wanted the latest and best thing for their battlefield memorial and the Milan Arch Bridge. What it is essentially is it's a series of steel arches pressed between two concrete uprights, and the whole idea is the more pressure you put on it, the arch springs and pushes against the concrete, so you don't get a bridge collapse if it gets overloaded. And so the White Bridge is a single Milan Arch. This is a double Milan Arch. So
Is the Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge a cantilever bridge? Is that the same?
It's cantilevered, but it's not. This is what they call a stressed arch bridge.
So it's a different concept.
Different concept entirely engineering-wise, yeah. And these are, we recently had them put in Hab's hair in the engineering record because there aren't that many survivors. So. This one's still all original. The White Bridge, we had a problem because the tour buses were trampolining it, and they were transmitting stress cracks and pavement ripples and stuff like that. So we poured a reinforced concrete arch over top of it to raise the rating of the bridge. Now, it's not a very good view because you know we're super low water, but rumor has it, I have not been able to find any written record. Old staff claimed that the Vanderbilt staff told them that they used black powder to help sculpt the stream to create more rills and little variations of visual and noise changes to the water. I have no way of proving it. Like I said, I heard it from the World War II generation who heard it from the Vanderbilt staff who claimed it.
You're on.
Yeah, the rustic bridge. It's a double arch Milan Arch bridge. The White Bridge is a single arch Milan Arch bridge, which are stressed steel frames between concrete abutments. So when they get overloaded, they trampoline rather than go to a state of collapse. And I don't know whether you caught it on the other one, that the only ones left that are used as road bridges are here at the Vanderbilt Mansion, and I believe the Vicksburg Battlefield has a few Milan Arch bridges still in service. They were later replaced by the steel and concrete straight deck bridges. But that technology didn't come along until 20 or 30 years after this. So that at the time, this was the latest and greatest. At some point, we're going to focus down on that hole, too. Okay, so we're stopping here to talk about dams, powerhouse, and water, and all that sort of good stuff. This is the powerhouse dam. As I said down below, it has nothing to do with running the powerhouse. It has to do with creating this scenic impoundment up to the White Bridge. And then you'll see there's a little dam under the White Bridge that creates this scenic impoundment to the wall at Route 9. It's really under Route 9 is the dam that powers the powerhouse. And what it was is it was about a 3 or 4 foot diameter riveted iron pipe that started out on the dam under Route 9. It comes all the way down through here with about a 23-foot drop from this top of Sherwood Pond to the turbine. And then that cobblestone building is the powerhouse. And you can see from where the cobblestone stopped to the peak of the roof, the basement under the powerhouse is about that high. That's where the turbine is. And then the outflow of the turbine goes into an area that's blasted out of solid rock into a pool. And again, the suction of the turbine acts like a supercharger. For the pressure of water coming in, there's suction coming out to make the turbine more efficient. And that little hole you see down on the base of the stream here is where the water comes out from beneath the turbine. And if you crawled up that hole right now, you would go into an area that looks kind of like a beehive with a pond in the middle of it. And you'd see the old turbine pipe coming down into that pond. So that's how it operates. The powerhouse there's a little demi-lune porch that we'll see when we approach it. And for years there was this, when they used to give tours of the powerhouse, there was always this bit of folk wisdom on the interpreter's part that was so that the guy could get away from the noise of the machinery. That may be true, but the real reason is these trees didn't exist. And what this would do is the penstock would come in, and would not only create electricity but pump water, and the water was pumped up a 4-inch main to a standpipe that was up behind the Howard Mansion on the other side of Route 9. You go up an escarpment to the Howard Mansion, then behind the Howard Mansion it goes up about another 50, 70 feet to the top of the ridge. There was what was called a standpipe, which looks like a big metal silo with no top on it. And he would stand out there, and when he saw the water project out the overflow at the top of the standpipe, he would know it was time to shut the pump off there. And it was a clear line of sight from here to the Howard Mansion at the time. So the water comes in a big penstock, drops in, it gets put into this turbine, and the turbine has a shaft coming out of it that would run the generator and another belt that would go up to the pump. And so this was DC power. So when we go in, you'll see, when we walk through all here, you'll see there's 3 rooms. One's the battery room, one's the work room, and then the other one's the generator room. So when there was low water and there wasn't enough water to operate the turbine, there was a big Morse single-cylinder naphtha engine that stands about 6.5, 7 feet high. It ran a little field generator that would trickle charge the batteries, because you really ran the lights off the batteries. And then it would also go down to a motor that would then be hooked up to the pump, so you could pump water for the toilets and sinks and so for the buildings around the property. All that equipment is still in there. The only thing that's gone is the batteries, because they were ripped out by the first superintendent, Christian Cooper, and given to a scrap tribe in World War II, along with the top. The stone wall on Route 9 was capped with a wrought iron picket fence, much the same as the one in front of the Wales House. And that was all cut off as a Boy Scout project for the scrap tribe. This was not a valuable historic estate at the time. This was just another big old white elephant, and there was a war on, so off it went. So I wanted to pause here so you could see this dam, the powerhouse from the outside, and then the White Bridge, which is the single arch Mealand Arch Bridge with the dam there. We're going to walk up and then through back to the powerhouse if you want to see the inside of the powerhouse, and we can talk about the machinery a little bit and how it operates. Not. You want me to talk about the White Bridge?
Yes.
Which is the White Bridge, which is now the main entrance, is a single arch Mealand Arch Bridge. Very similar engineering to the one that's exposed in Central Park, which is now a footbridge. Not really, because we're not maintaining it. I mean, it's the start of the path to the powerhouse at this end, and then it terminates down on the other side of the rustic bridge down at the coach house. But beyond the powerhouse, it's interrupted because the path actually cuts down along the stream and was actually like a laid stone wall, like walking on the top of a stone wall along the stream. And decades of ice and winter runs and stuff like that have sort of disrupted that wall, so it's not a continuous path through anymore. But it was in Vanderbilt's time.
Yeah, I think I'm going to pass on.
Okay, well this is the pump house / powerhouse. And if you look around the corner there, there's this little loggia. That's what I told you about, but you could see the standpipe and get out of the noise. And the noise of this machinery must have been ferocious back in the day. We put all this cladding on it to protect it from vandals. The historic doors are behind them, they're open, and they're still on. We only have 2 surviving windows, so these things are a little casement, little diamond pane windows, leaded glass. Pretty well beaten up. This building actually was going to be torn down by the Park Service by the superintendent in the early 1970s, and the region came up with money to repair the roof and soffit and so on. And basically that's the last work it had. In the 1980s, I wrote the historic structures report for the building and trying to get volunteers and funds to clean it up and reopen it as an interpreter. It wasn't completely successful. The one thing we did do at least is we got all the collapsed ceilings cleaned up. We got the stalls back to the coach house where they belong. And And we've got the machinery protected under some plastic. So, have a look, sir. Okay. What you have, we used to have a string light that went down there, but I don't see it hooked up anymore. The ladder is over there. And in fact, I don't know if I can. Well, let's start with the overall operation. That's right down there, that pipe is the penstock, and that's the turbine case. There's a Pelton wheel turbine in there. And you can see how deep the basement is. Now, that pulley and clutch system goes to the generator here, and the far pulley and clutch system goes up to this 3-cylinder Gould triplex pump up here. And that has a pipe coming off the penstock. That would pump the water up another pipe to the standpipe behind the Howard mansion on the other side of Route 9. That's a 3-cylinder Gould pump. Then, if you want to, I think we can see in this end here. That's the Deal dynamo that would generate 100 volts of DC current. Now, and that current would be controlled through this power panel. I think you were asking me earlier about where it could go. You see that looks like a clock face there, all those points? That's where you could shunt power off to different facilities and buildings. Now, as we were saying before, with alternating current, if you don't have enough power, you up the amperage. With direct current, if you don't have enough power, you have to up the voltage. So this was a nominal 100-volt system. And under those tarps there is a paired, what's called a motor generator. What would happen is those would be tied together, and the electricity would go in the motor spinning this extra generator, and the generator would put out 110 volts to sort of give a kick. So when they were using a lot of power at the coach house and the mansion all at the same time, that would boost it up to what it normally would be. Now you see those glass windows are there for a reason, because that room would have been filled with acid fumes. Now you see the curved ceiling. This is the only place where the ceiling pretty much survived, more or less intact. When the roof went back in the 50s and 60s, the ceiling kind of went. I'm going to digress a little bit. When you had periods of low water, there was not enough water to run the turbine. As I said before, behind us here, that is a single-cylinder engine. That's a Fairbanks Morse. It was either run on gas or naphtha, but you can see it's in the same base as this generator. And actually, no, I had it incorrect before. I think that's a Bullock generator, and this is the Deal generator. And so this engine would run, and this generator is much smaller than the main one, but it would have enough power to trickle charge the batteries. And also, at the other end of the water pump pulley is a smaller electric motor. By smaller, I mean it's like this big. And that would be hooked up to this to run the water pump, so you'd have enough water for sinks and for flushing and so on. So that's the motor generator set that was the low water backup to the system. Now, like I said, on this side, that was the battery room. And this side was you see there's a sink there, there was a stove here. This was the workshop, and that's the coal bin for the little stove where the repair parts were kept. Years ago when we cleaned this out, Curatorial took all the bits and pieces out of the cabinets, and it's all down in the coach house now in the storage bins. And we're going to come through and take a quick look at the battery room. Watch your step, because there's nothing but debris here. Now, when I say battery room, you have to think of this in different terms than like today with like flashlight or car batteries. What this was, those those pieces of wood are all framing for a series of troughs and wiring. And you see those little nubbins on the edge of the cabinet there? That's where they cut off all the wire. The DC, you can see the DC wire is much heavier. That's one of the reasons why AC was preferable, because you can transmit it over longer distances with fewer losses. And for the same voltage, you can get away with a much thinner wire than you can with DC. That's the back end of the power panel. But this is where the trough, and what you had is you had a series of troughs in here that were filled with acid, and there were alternating plates. There were lead plates with glass spacers, lead plate, glass spacer. So it was like a do-it-yourself battery, and those plates would all be soldered and wired up to the thing, all engineered out. And like I said, this would have been filled with battery acid fumes, and so if you look up, there was 4 of these. Those are vents that go right up into the attic space. And if you look at the building, there's 2 openings so that the wind coming across would create a mild suction to keep the fumes continuously leaving the room here so it wouldn't get a little too thick. And this is also the room that still has the 2 surviving. This is what all the windows would have looked like back in the day. So what they did in 1940-41, when we took over, is Central Hudson came in, and you can see all they did was they hooked the AC power into the old DC system. Then around 1957-58, we discontinued the use of the powerhouse completely because, number one, the heavy wire was wasteful, but also you can share neutrals a lot more with direct current than you can with alternating current. It really wasn't quite a safe system. So around 1957-58, we ran a cable directly into the mansion, a cable directly into the coach house, and so on, to a more modern AC system. Then this building was run off of a little side circuit from the gardener's cottage, and then in the 80s when we cleaned it up, Central Hudson donated a new incoming power supply, so the building has its own power. So the building that used to supply power out now gets it from outside.
Am I allowed to take pictures from here?
No flash.
Yeah, no flash. Yeah, where the dark spot on the light is, that's the old fly ball governor that regulated the turbine originally. And then that's the motor that would run the pulley to the water pump pulley back in periods of low water. And by the way, that dripping that's coming down is actually the pipe that goes to the old standpipe. So obviously somewhere between here and the Howard Mansion, the pipe's compromised and groundwater's leaking in now. But the guy would regularly go down there to service the equipment, add oil to the cups and change belts on the machinery and shift things. But to shift it, you didn't have to go down there for it, because over here, this one here engaged the clutch for the water pump. The one behind the camera engaged the clutch for the generator, and this one, along with the fly ball governor, regulated the speed of the turbine.
What would you like to see become of this building? I know at one time.
What I'd love to see is I'd love to see us at least cosmetically restore it and interpret it. It's one of the few examples surviving of this kind of technology in a space where you can actually see it all, the engine generation, the water generation, the power, the pumping, and really talk about it as part of the complete estate, functioning estate that existed at the turn of the century in America, as well as transitional technology.